Greetings everybody and welcome to one of our Flowgear bite-sized videos, the purpose of which is to get you, the integrator, up to speed with some of the very important features and concepts within the Flowgear platform. And on top of that, we'll be looking at one of our very common use cases. The very first thing we're going to want to do is to log into our Flowgear tenant. Now we will have provided you with a Flowgear tenant ID. You can see I've plugged mine in on the top here, and then you'll obviously provide the user against which you would like to authenticate. Once that's been done, you can go ahead and click on Next, and that's going to log you into the Flowgear console. Now, based on the user you provided, your role will determine what you can and can't do. So through role-based access, effectively, you'll be able to navigate to certain portions of the Flowgear console. Now, ultimately, each of these Flowgear tenants is deployed against its own VM, which is going to provide you with a maximum level of separation and security. Now, the primary purpose of the console is to provide you, the user, with a space in which you can seamlessly transition to the different elements of the platform that you may find yourself working with. How this is functionally done is through selecting any of the navigational elements of on the navigation bar on the left-hand side. Let's start at the bottom, and we can go through a handful of these. Starting with drop points. Drop points are a lightweight agent that you can install on-prem, which is going to facilitate a persistent outbound connection to the primary Flowgear environment. What this functionally means is, irrespective of where your primary Flowgear environment is hosted, you're going to be able to install this tool directly on another on-prem system and still be able to get data to and from your Flowgear environment and the system in which you've installed the tool against. Connections are a place to plug in credentials unique to a particular platform or product. So if we open up one of our connections, just as an example, Salesforce, you'll notice that we can plug in credentials that would serve to authenticate you with Salesforce. And we'll be specific around what we require within the naming of the particular properties. And you can also take a look at our help article, which is going to give you an idea of what each one does and how you could potentially acquire it. Now, you can effectively go and test against that as well using the test connection button. There we go. You will then note that you have in fact been able to connect to that environment. You'll also see that you can go and click on different environments here. Test UAT in production. Functionally, this allows you to plug in different sets of credentials for the different environments you may own or have access to. Now, you can customize this. You can have additional environments. You can change their names. You can remove some. Ultimately, we're not always aware of what your environment looks like in terms of lifecycle management, so you get to set it up according to what your current policy or procedure has been up until this point. It also plays a large role in how we do lifecycle management in general within Flowgear, and we'll get to that a bit later as well. Now let's take a look at workflow logs. This is a place in which we are able to store the transactional inputs and outputs of all the nodes that have executed within the platform. And you can see what those inputs and outputs are here. You can also redact that as well. So anything you do not want to be stored can be redacted and therefore will never be stored on the Flowgear platform. And functionally what this place does is it allows developers or anybody developing or maintaining these solutions to have a very good view of what has happened on the platform so that they could potentially debug and solve a problem should one arise. It's not going to fill the purpose of reporting to your end users or integration reporting in general. Those kinds of tasks whereby, as an example, you want to report a number of invoices processed, which of them failed and why they failed, that would be something that is built alongside the workflows themselves. Finally, we can take a look at workflows. Workflows are the design canvases on which we actually build these solutions. So here's where we then facilitate that drag and drop and low to no code design. And we're going to go ahead and open one up and give you a bit more detail around what that looks like. Let's go ahead and open up a brand new workflow. You can go ahead and do this by clicking on the new workflow button over here. We'll then have a randomly generated name, which of course you're welcome to change. And we can go ahead and confirm that on the bottom right. We're then greeted with a Flowgear design canvas, the primary purpose of which is to expose all of Flowgear's pre-built tooling so that you, the integrator, can drag and drop that onto the canvas and then build some kind of integration or automation, really to whatever level of complexity you require. Now, as I've said, there's a big emphasis on drag and drop, and there's an emphasis on low to no code based on your preference and the kind of tools you'd like to use. Now, how we can expose these tools to the canvas is by clicking on any of the plus icons you see popping up as I hover around. And we're then going to be greeted with these tools as a list of nodes. We call them nodes. They're best described as elements that can be dropped onto the design canvas that will then provide a particular integration process. So in other words, they're going to be doing something for you. Now, depending on what they're doing for you, we'll have them categorized into one of 4 distinct categories. The very first category is our connectors. They will effectively connect to the systems that we want to integrate and automate, and they do this by exposing as much of that vendor's API functionality as is possible, and exposing those actions at something called samples. That might not make a lot of sense right now, but you'll see exactly what that looks like a little bit later. We then have triggers. Triggers will determine the condition upon which a workflow executes. So in other words, it allows you to determine whether your workflow should execute once daily, based off of an email arriving in an inbox, a particular queue. There are a number of mechanisms to determine whether your workflow should kick off. Processes are going to work with data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prepare it for the next stage, whether that's one of many or the final stage of ingress. Effectively, what these nodes will do is ensure that you can enrich, supplement, transform, and validate the data to get it into the systems that you're actually attempting to integrate with. And finally, flow control gives you the ability to enable conditional branching on the canvas, and that conditional branching will form the high-level logic for things like error handling, business logic, any kind of decision making that the workflow has to actually make, even if that data has to be handled by a separate workflow or anything of that sort. Now, ultimately, it's a collection of all of these nodes that allow you to build these integrations to whatever level of complexity you require. Triggers are then going to facilitate the condition upon which the workflow executes. So it will determine whether your workflow should kick off twice daily, once an email arrives in a particular inbox, monitor a particular queue. There's a number of options for why a workflow would or wouldn't kick off. We then have processes, the primary purpose of which is to go ahead and work with the extracted data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prep it for the next step, whether that is one of many steps or the final step of ingress. Functionally, they will go ahead and transform, enrich, validate, and supplement those data sets so that you can move them across to the systems you want them to be in. Finally, we have flow control. Flow control nodes will allow you to enable conditional branching on the canvas, which forms a big portion of your high-level logic or decision making. This could be error handling. This could be determining whether a particular process has to be kicked off by a sub-workflow, whether an invoice has to be processed with a different kind of mapping. It is once again going to allow you to make a lot of the decisions that make up your production-ready workflow. It is, of course, a collection of all of these different categories that allow you to build these integrations and automations to whatever level of complexity you require. Enterprise API gives you the ability to turn any workflow into an API-bound endpoint. This means that through the typical design experience within Flowgear, you can go ahead and expose some of that functionality or data to a web endpoint, which can then be consumed by a third-party application or program that has the ability to do so. So here, in a very brief example, we're extracting information from SQL, we're mapping that into a JSON payload, and we're functionally exposing that to an endpoint that somebody can consume. And we can see how this is done by heading over to Settings, Workflow Settings, and we'll notice that we've applied a get binding to this workflow. We have our demo domain, of course, which should be customizable according to your tenant, and then we have the actual URL for test contacts. And should somebody have this URL and the appropriate access token, they can go ahead and extract a list of contacts from the database that we've hooked up within Flowgear. Revision management is a feature which allows you to inspect the design of a previous version of a workflow. You can do so by clicking on the revision history button over here. And then you can take a look at the different versions that had been saved in the past and open up any one of them. That provides you with the design of that workflow at the time that it was saved. You can then even revert to that version as the latest version by saving over the workflow, and you'll be expected to ensure that you are happy to do so by confirming with a yes for confirmation. Revision management is one of the many tools Flowgear exposes as part of our lifecycle management suite. Release management is another powerful feature within Flowgear's suite of lifecycle management tools. Release management works by preventing workflow design changes from immediately affecting production. This is done by enforcing the process of a user with the appropriate permissions promoting workflow design across the relevant environments until it is ready to be promoted into production. Let's take a look at how this is actually performed. So here we have a workflow which we're going to go ahead and save. We can provide a save or commit message over here. And then we'll receive confirmation of the workflow being saved through the green banner. At which point we can go ahead and open up the release management by clicking on this button over here. We will notice that this particular workflow has a version in test, but none in UAT or production yet. And so what we can do at this point is we can actually promote the workflow across to UAT. This will then allow us to execute the workflow in the UAT environment using the credentials that were provided in the connection under the UAT tab. And then once we're happy with that, we can go ahead and do the final portion by promoting this into production. Similarly to what I've just done. Now you're welcome to use the UI that Flowgear exposes to do this, but realistically what's happening in the back end is these particular designs are going to be stored as GitHub commits. And so you can actually see a text-based version of the workflow, which you can then compare against older versions. So while you're welcome to use it in the manner that I've just shown you, ideally you're able to forklift whatever your lifecycle management policy and procedure is into something like a GitHub environment and effectively run your pipelines and your commits and approvals as you've been doing up until now. The scenario we'll be addressing within this particular demo would be sales order creation from Shopify to 365 sales. Now, to give you a bit of context as to how this might work, in a real world application, you of course have some kind of e-commerce potentially within your environment, and you want to get those orders that have now been created by customers online as they've done their shopping into your ERP or your platform, which is actually meant to capture those sales orders. Now, in this case, that is of course Shopify on the left-hand side and 365 sales on the other side. And so effectively what we're then going to focus on is the use of our branded Shopify and 365 sales connector and some of the supporting elements of building an integration towards this use case. As always, let's take a look at what this integration is actually supposed to be doing for us. Now, what we're trying to do is get these sales orders from Shopify into 365 sales. And so what this is going to look like is, of course, to query those orders and push them along into this 365 environment. So if we execute this particular workflow, we'll notice the activity log is giving us a step of what's happening. Now at a very high level, we're querying those orders. We're actually mapping all of them and then splitting them up one by one so we can determine what work needs to be done on an individual level. And there's a reason for this. One is we want to check individually, first of all, if we've not maybe already processed that order. Now this particular order has been seen as missing, and so it goes along with the process. Then within the scope of 365, there's a secondary process where we have to then create a line. So we do so as well. And all the way through, we're checking whether the order was created first, and then if the line was created, and then finalizing the order completion process. Now, we can take a look, first of all, what that order would have looked like on this side, which that particular one was D3. And we can see an idea of that order here sitting in Shopify. And then we can head over to 365, do a refresh, and we expect to see that order here within the scope of our 365 environment. This order is effectively a draft, and so we've just used a placeholder product as we don't, of course, have matching inventory through these two sandbox environments. But ultimately, this is just to show the order sitting on the other side. Now that we have a blank canvas, let's take a look at what it'll take to build out some of the components that you saw me execute a little bit earlier. So kicking off the process, to keep it simple, the first thing we always want to achieve within the scope of an integration is the extract, transform, and load components of the integration. And so what we're going to do that is go ahead and pick the appropriate nodes to do those roles, which should of course be extraction through Shopify. We have a number of connectors here actually, including the GraphQL connector, but we're going to go with a normal REST connector for now. We'll go ahead and use QuickMap for the actual transformation portion of it. And then we'll go ahead and plug our 365 sales connector onto the other side. Then of course, we're going to go ahead and pick a connection, which we will do so through clicking on the drop down here. Now, these connections, of course, will represent the credentials that you have to plug in for that particular platform or product, and you can take a look at what's expected by opening up that connection here. We did briefly touch on this earlier, but for instance, in the case of your 365 sales, you may be required to use something like a service client or an organization service proxy. Both have been selected, so now the next step, of course, as always, is to go ahead and pick the particular sample from the list of samples. Now, you can do this by clicking on the options, choose a sample, and this will give you a list of potential actions that you can perform against that particular environment. It could be tens, hundreds, or thousands of samples. It all depends on the type of documentation and the number of endpoints that that particular platform or product exposes. Now, for us, functionally, we want to go and look for retrieve a list of draft orders, which we can then go ahead and select. And that's actually going to prime the node for the action of retrieving draft orders, as well as in some cases give us custom properties that we can provide. We don't mind too much about this. We'll just go and provide a hard-coded limit for this. At this point, we can go ahead and do the exact same thing for the Microsoft side of things, where once again, we'll go ahead and click on choose sample. Here we have, again, thousands of these samples, and we can then go and add something like sales order to then have create sales order as an option. Once selected, it's going to prep the node again and then provide us with a sample payload of what it looks like going into 365. And so we can see an example on both sides. Here's our request. Here's our response. These samples can then be hooked up to the quick map. And we can then click on change view on the quick map to actually see a data tree left and right hand side, whereby we can drag the data across from point to point to then populate fields on the right hand side and adhere to the structure of the target system, but of course using data from the source. Now in this case, each draft order would be a sales order, and we can go ahead and hook up, for argument's sake, city to city, and then immediately we'll see a preview of what that's going to look like on the other side, representing the data now coming from the left hand side, but in the structure that's expected. Now on top of the structural mapping, which is of course integral to getting this right, you can run functions on top of these expression blocks, which will further enrich and supplement that data. You can click to see a list of all of these functions, but it is things like sum, count, lookup, if statements, string and math operations. That's going to allow you to get the data to a next level of effectively cleanliness and completion, depending on the business rules you have to implement. So I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to a finalized mapping here. This is just a condensed view of what we've effectively mapped across. Specifically for the order header, we obviously have to map the particular account that it belongs to, which you can then go ahead and hard code or provide dynamically. We have order numbers, which is effectively going to use the particular hour of the day, as well as the addition of another field. And then things like generating a particular GUID for the sales order can be done as well using these functions. Now we can actually go ahead and close this off. And as we hook this up, then of course from point to point, we could go ahead and execute this just as I'd shown you previously. Now this is just a portion of it. If you'll allow us to swap back to the previous version we ran, we can touch on some of the additional things we've added to make this a little bit more production ready. So as always, we have our elements of extract, transform, and load, and you can see the extraction from Shopify, the mapping, which looks very similar to what you saw previously, and then of course the load portion. But within the respect of this particular integration, we've done a couple extra things. First of those is to go ahead and split those records one by one using a for each node. That then sends one record at a time downstream where we can check using getKeyValue if that unique order ID has been processed before. And that order ID would of course be that's coming from Shopify. We attempt the creation if it's missing. We use our if equal node to see whether the response was successful or not. And if it was unsuccessful, we can log that as a failure as part of our error handling process. Otherwise, we can go ahead and move on to the next step, which is line creation. Now, in reality, you would have another mapping phase for the line, but we've kept this simple just to show the step in itself. But again, you would have another quick map right over here whereby you can then actually map the lines. Line creation is tested for success. And then finally, do we have a complete order, or was a line failure what happened here? And so this should give you an idea of what a more production-ready solution might look like at the end of the day. That's about that. In terms of what we wanted to show you here today is, of course, the core of any integration, which is extract, transform, and load, and then dive a bit into what it takes to make a production-ready integration, or at least make something robust with respect to error handling. So at its core, you'll always have to use the tools to extract the data, transform it, and pass it along, but what kind of decisions and business rules are you implementing past that fact? You're welcome to take a look at what tools Flowgear exposes on our website, but ultimately, if you need to do things like check deltas, check duplicates, any kind of error handling and notification of those errors, that's all available within the platform as well. If you're interested in exploring some of the concepts and features that I've just shown you in more depth, you're welcome to head over to help.flowgear.net, where you'll find a list of comprehensive articles giving you more detail on some of the things that I've shown you today. On top of that, you're welcome to sign up for a free trial and explore Flowgear at your own pace. We do have a certification course available that'll take you through some of the foundational elements of Flowgear. And then finally, if you'd like, you're welcome to reach out to our team and inquire about a complimentary proof of concept where we can go ahead and show you some of what you're looking to achieve as part of the POC process.